Hi, everybody. Um, so, Sexy Brutale. I mean, like I said, I really super enjoyed that. I am not shocked at the direction that it went, but I can't say that I like called it. Um, I did feel like there was something sort of spooky going on in terms of uh like who is who are the owners of this mansion, and like what is their deal, and why haven't we seen them, and uh like what is going on. And it seemed less likely that they were being just randomly murderous than like, there was something darker happening. But I definitely bought into the sort of demonic vibe, and didn't necessarily see it as this is all like a mental projection of the protagonist's guilt. But I like that. I like that story, right? And this has been a common theme in a lot of the games that I mean, honestly, maybe too many of the games that have been the kind of mechanically interesting but narratively focused action adventure games that I have really, really liked for this show, and liked playing on stream and liked talking about. Papoyo and Among the Sleep, and this game are in my mind some of the highlights of play by play, just because I think they fit really well with the format of the show, and they've been short and interesting, and there's been lots to talk about. And it's weird that they're kind of all about this psychological projection, which, I mean, that I love like messed up, weird, sad stories, and I love unreliable narrators, and sort of playing with the role of the protagonist. I love all of that, but the similarities between those three stories in the end are like they're weirdly similar, which is interesting. That's just an interesting sort of thing to note, I guess. Okay. I'm going to start with Cage Tiger, who asked me a question on Twitter earlier this week about the term diorama game, which I used to describe this at the very outset, just based on the description of the game that I had sort of read, and without knowing too much about it. So what the heck does diorama game mean? It's interesting. I'm not 100% sure where that term comes from, and I don't know that it's an industry term. Doing a little bit of research, I did not find a lot of reference to it, and it's hard for me to tell whether that's because this aspect, this sort of part of interactive media, is not like super well explored, or if this is a term that I literally just made up. This is a type of game that I studied. I'm not going to say extensively, but more extensively back in school during my MFA. This was something that I was introduced to by Jamie Antonise, who was my design partner for a while. Fantastic guy. Is now working on Guildlings mobile game that I think is going to launch next year. Really excited about it. Jamie is just awesome, and he's the one who got me into games. He had he has worked on a couple of variations of this kind of idea, but he came to me early on with this concept for a game that is a story box. Jamie's a writer by background, and is very into narrative games, like a lot of us are. And games that tell stories. So what he sort of wanted to create, and did, do some work on, were games that were about multiple intersecting characters who and multiple intersecting stories, spaces that contained lots of narrative, that were just dense with narrative. So characters that were doing interesting things, playing out little dramas, environmental narrative that suggested stuff. Okay, and so the game of these story boxes, these dioramas, was that as a player, there was too much narrative for you to see it all at once. So you would have to choose what was interesting to you. What story threads did you want to follow? And the clearest example of this that I can find is a game that Jamie and Mike Rossmassler, who's another MFA student and is now a game designer, the two of them developed a tabletop game, a book-based game, sort of a non-traditional book game, I guess. It was a picture this. What do you call it? Like a binder with pages that you could put cards into, like a baseball card book, baseball card binder, that had they had set up. I can't remember if this would be weird, but somehow they had. Oh no, maybe it was 16. It was 16 cards on a page. And each page represented a slice of 15 seconds. And each of the 16 cards represented 16 different locations that were laid out in approximately a square. And you could flip through the book and pull out one of the cards and turn it around and read the back of it, and it would tell you what happened in that space during that 15 seconds. And then the game of it was sort of, you would start out on the first page at like time 0 at 12 o'clock, and look at a couple of the cards, and there would be characters all over the place. And now, do you follow those characters as the characters move around the spaces? Are you interested in the conversations that they're having, which requires you to sort of keep track of two different characters that are having a conversation, because each of they tended to be in two different locations, and their side of the conversation would happen in their respective location? Or are you interested in sort of like the story of a particular space, because you could just follow that space through time, and march all the way forward through the whatever it was, I don't know, 10, it was probably like 4 minutes or something like that. that were represented by the game. Or were you interested in sort of like taking a snapshot of a particular moment and seeing what's going on everywhere all around the space station? It all took place on a space station. This was a game called Control, and Jamie showed it to me and let me borrow it, I guess. I mean, he must have, because I took all of the content, everything that the two of them had written for this game, and digitized it. And there's actually a really bad game, like digital and executable file that is it's not really bad, it's pretty bad. It was a rush job. It was slapdash that contains all of this, and you can play it within the application. And a big part of it is that it restricts you very heavily on how you can move through this narrative space. Anyway, it's called Control. I'm trying to figure out the best way to publish it. Probably going to publish it in some manner at some point, but didn't have a chance to do anything with it this week. But I'll let you guys know. I'll remind you of what I'm talking about if anybody wants to check it out when it goes up. Control, really cool. Mostly because the writing was really good. Jamie and Mike did that. That was the piece that I put together for my application to the MFA program. So that was like my interactive media project as part of my application. That's sort of why I have such fond memories of it. So Control is a diorama game. It's a game where the player's experience is not about interacting with the world. The player has no ability to change what's going on, what's there, what's happening. The player's experience is more like looking at a diorama or is there a different word for, in a museum, the sort of like set piece that gets put up to show natural history in its proper context or whatever, like that kind of thing. And the player's interaction, this is so funny. I hadn't actually thought about it like this. There was a time when I was deep in academia studying critical theory of games when the question of, okay, but what is interactive media kept coming up. And, isn't a book interactive media because you choose what order you read the pages in? You read it at your own pace. You must interact with it in order to get the story. And the story is presented in a linear fashion, but it's up to you to actually digest it in that way, which I always thought was like utter bullshit. A book is not interactive. But a diorama game is interactive, and a diorama game is laid out very similar to a book, but with controls and constraints on the player that forces you to pay attention to only small pieces of it at a time and to make choices about which pieces you care to look at. So I don't remember if diorama game was a term that Jamie and I came up with, a term that we read somewhere in our research of prior art on this kind of work, or something that I have made up in the interim, but that's how I think about these games now when I think back to like when we used to make them. And Jamie did a bunch of them during his academic career. He was very good at them and very interested in them. He and I collaborated on some stuff as well. We talked about them a lot though. And it's always been something that's been really interesting to me. It's not common. It's not like a really well explored aspect of interactive media though. And there aren't a lot of diorama games out there. Even when you consider that when I say that, the suggestion is that that is the entirety of a game, and indeed, like Control, that's literally what it is. Control is just a diorama game. In practical terms, diorama game is the kind of term that actually describes an interactive system, and like real actual games that you would play are typically made up of some amalgamation of a bunch of different systems, like that. Like, you might have a game that is an action adventure game, but it has an inventory system, and an inventory system, is kind of, that's not necessary. You don't need that for an action adventure game. Well, for an adventure game, I guess you do. For, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you can have a tile placement game that doesn't have a bidding mechanic, but you can also put a bidding mechanic in there. There are games that have diorama elements to them, and it's been really interesting to see that crop up occasionally. This game, Sexy Brutale, is, in the way that it seems to be modeled after Sleep No More, is the closest thing that I've seen to a true diorama game, since the academic experiments that Jamie did and that I did with him. Sleep No More is actually like the most incredible diorama game I've ever seen, which I know that I've talked about that show here, but for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's running in New York right now, and if you have the opportunity to go, I highly recommend it. It's not cheap, but it is a good show. It's a retelling of Macbeth, in a hotel. So you experience, it's immersive theater, which is extremely game-like. And you play it, you watch it by entering the Kittredge Hotel and donning a mask, and then going out into the area. And there's several floors of it's not really a hotel, it's a warehouse that's been made up to look like a hotel, but there are several vertical floors and then multiple rooms on each floor, and there are characters who, over the course of the 3 hours of performance, act out their part, going from room to room and up and down stairs as is appropriate for their character, and interacting with other characters when they come across one another, or going off and doing secretive, nefarious things, and you play this by following them around and deciding at any moment, do I want to stay here and see what's going on? Do I want to just take a few minutes to check out the scenery, try to figure out what's up with this room that I'm in? Do I want to go maybe see if I can find some other character who I haven't seen in a while but looked interesting? And the way that Sleep No More works, at least in an ideal case, the way that they run people through it is a little bit weird and I don't understand it, but if you do it right, then you get there at the beginning of the performance, and most of the performance happens 3 times. Not in this explicit time is looping sort of a way that this game does, but something very similar to it, where you have the opportunity actually to follow the same thread for a while and then take a different path and follow a different character, or go see what was happening at the same time that something else is happening. So yeah, anyway, Sleep No More, awesome diorama game. It is, I mean, it's the thing that really cracked that nut wide open. There were other works of immersive theater that preceded it. Tamara is sort of the big one that I never got to see, but it does a similar thing in some ways. It has been less present in digital games, but it has definitely... I haven't played Tacoma yet. That's very much on my list. So Sleep No More, obviously Majora's Mask. We've talked about Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask contains diorama game elements. It is obviously much more than that. But there's a part of that game that is sort of like going back in time and just seeing what's going on at various times. And you have the ability to follow characters around. It's very diorama game, like Control, like Sleep No More, because there's this element, and like Sexy Brutale, there's this element of repetition that means that you have more freedom. You have like considerable agency in what you want to follow. So even though the stories play out over time, you have the ability to sort of, flip through them, if not entirely at will, then sort of more than linear time would allow you to do. But then there are other games that, so Float Point is the other one that I could think of that is maybe closest to this. Float Point is somewhat different. It doesn't have the time looping element, and it doesn't even have the sort of like, Float Point is really more a game that is about environmental narrative, because the areas that you can explore are not super inhabited. They're mostly uninhabited, and there are actually some things that you can do, like there are puzzles that you can solve. It is more it's a text adventure. It's by Emily Short. It's more text adventure-y. It's interactive fiction. But it has the spirit, it has the tone, its experience is that of a diorama game. There's nothing that you can do that affects the story in a meaningful way until the very end of the game, and then you are asked to make a single choice that dramatically changes the outcome that is told to you as, like, years later what happens because of this single important choice that you made. So the whole game is trying to get the information that you will use to make that choice, exploring the world enough to get a sense of, like, what are all of the stories that are being told here that will weigh on the decision that I want to make. So Float Point, I feel like, is really important because it has that same experience as the sort of other, like the stricter diorama games. But actually closer in form to other diorama games are like Oblivion. Oblivion was huge when it launched. Oblivion and Skyrim, obviously, but and I'm sure Fallout. I haven't played nearly as much of Fallout, but Oblivion, when it launched, was it was the successor to Morrowind. And so that was the comparison that people made and that marketing made, right? Was this game, what is it compared to Morrowind? How is it better than Morrowind? Which I don't want to get into a fight about Oblivion versus Morrowind. But one of the things that it does that Morrowind never did is it tried to create this lifelike non-player character that had a routine. Oblivion was trying to break this mold of RPGs that goes back forever, where non-player characters would exist to sort of inhabit and give a sense of life to towns and things like that. You'd have shopkeepers, and you'd have tavern keepers, and you'd have people that you could talk to in the streets. But they would pretty much just exist in a fixed location for you to go up and talk to. And there are exceptions to this in a strict sense, but like Zelda 2, Adventure of Link, there were people in the towns that would walk through the town, but they were just like very simple cardboard people who would just walk through the town. Stardew Valley definitely has a diorama element. Like Oblivion, it's not necessarily about... the game is not about... Stardew Valley more so, because you care about people's routines. You want to be able to find them so that you can talk to them and give them gifts and things like that. Oblivion, some of that, but it was mostly like this this novel implementation of the shopkeeper doesn't just exist in the shop all the time. The shopkeeper has a home, and they sleep in their home, and in the morning they get up and they eat breakfast, and then, well, maybe they didn't eat breakfast. I don't remember if NPCs ate in Oblivion. Maybe they did. And then he would leave his home, and he would go to the shop, and he would open it up, and he would stand there for a while, and then he would close it, and he would go to the tavern, and he would sit in the tavern, and then he would eat dinner, and then he would go home and sit by the fire for a couple of hours, and then he would go up to bed and fall asleep and do the same thing the next day. And these were scripted routines. Like, this wasn't AI in a real sense. This wasn't like procedurally generated behavior. This was just, that's what the shopkeeper does. He does that pretty much every day, or based on certain conditions. And but that was a pattern that you could learn. You could follow the shopkeeper around and see him do this. And in Oblivion, this was mostly used for like, hey, if I want to rob the shop, like, I can pay attention to the patterns of the shopkeeper and know when, like, nobody's going to be around because he's asleep, and like that kind of thing. There wasn't a lot of narrative embedded in those behaviors, but there could be. I mean, there was simple narrative. There was, pretty much the same thing over and over again of people who lived really boring lives in these towns, but they did. Like, you could explore that. That was diorama. Stardew, same thing. Like, the NPCs have these scripted behaviors based on different conditions, and it matters. Like, you care about following them around, and those are even a little bit more narrative because they're personally expressive. Like, the person who likes to fish will go out fishing, and I don't remember what they all do, but like, they're based on personality, and they're sort of rich with personality in a way that Oblivions weren't. Yeah, The Novelist was a little bit of a diorama game. If you guys remember that, that was a game where, for the most part, like, the events just played out, and we were just watching them, like, during those daytime sequences, and that's sort of what we were doing. Is we were just trying to figure out, like, what is the best way that we can observe the story that is playing out in front of us here. Her story, so database narrative. Her story is not a diorama game, it's a database narrative, which is a slightly different thing, but it's related. And database narrative is a form of recombinant narrative, where instead of splitting up your narrative between sort of logically consistent geographical locations, for example, like you would in environmental narrative. Like Her Story is environmental narrative. It's really not Her Story. Gone Home is environmental narrative. It's a game that's all about like exploring this house and trying to understand the stories of the people who live there through the environment that they live in, through the things that they have left behind, through the choices that they made in their decoration, in what they have kept, in what they've created. Environmental narrative, I mean, BioShock is sort of really, it's well cited as a sort of an early and expert execution of environmental narrative. Database narrative is taking those kinds of like fragments of story, but instead of putting them into separate rooms, it puts them into a more abstract organizational structure, and then relates them conceptually. So rather than like traveling physically from room to room around a geography, and accessing pieces of narrative that way, Her Story, which is like incredibly pure example of database narrative, you access very short video clips based on the transcript of the dialogue within them. If you haven't played Her Story, definitely play it. It's really good. But it starts with a video and a prompt where you can just type in a word. And you type in a word, and it basically like brings up, it does a search. It does a search of a like virtual file system for all of the video clips that contain that word. And then you can watch all of those. And you're trying to figure out like what are the words that will give me access to video clips that will tell me what the fuck is going on, that will like allow me to understand more of this narrative. You can see the relationship, right, between environmental narrative, where your narrative is spread out around a physical environment, database narrative, where you're accessing pieces of the narrative in sort of non-chronological, non-consistent order, and then trying to assemble it mentally into something that makes sense. And a diorama game where you are using space as one of the inputs, as one of the ways that you separate this narrative out. And you are similarly accessing the narrative in a constrained way that gives you sort of a fragmentary approach to what the hell is going on. You follow one character and you only get a little peek at what is going on in the whole, the entire environment. And then you have to sort of work to piece all of that together. So Her Story, Gone Home. The Sims would be a diorama game if there were a story. Like if there was a scripted story, if it was actually telling something, it would be a diorama game. It's like a simulation of it's still related. It's very related. It's sort of like it's not about the direct action on the world. It's about what you choose to what stories you choose to watch and follow within this sort of large and dense narrative space. What it's really lacking is scripted narrative, is actually like juicy narrative that you can sink your teeth into. Instead, it has emergent narrative, which is super interesting in its own right, but a different beast. BioShock, I mentioned. Portal does environmental narrative really well. Deus Ex does environmental narrative really well, especially through like computer terminals. The new Deus Ex games, all the Bethesda games, obviously. Yeah, Okay, that's my mini lecture on diorama games. Um, that was the big thing that I want to make sure that I got a chance to talk about. So let's look real quick at some of the other questions that people had. Kyla, I hope that that answers your question and is useful. And I hope that that term is useful because at the very least, I don't know of another term for that type of game. Um, Even if that is not, but be aware, I guess, that this is not like this is not a super well explored area, and that I don't know what the origins of that term are. It's probably not going to be generally understood if you just use it in conversation the way that I do when I just like to throw it out there. Um, I mean, honestly, I was just waiting for somebody to ask me what the fuck a diorama game was. So good job, Kyla. Do you feel like it was easy or hard? This is Miss Random Badger. Do you feel like it was easy or hard to navigate the space? Does it expand progressively at such a rate that makes you able to learn the map? Alternatively, do you feel like it's supposed to have some maze-like properties? So I talked a little bit about the space and the way that the character's relationship to the space and the way that the game changes sort of how that space is laid out in the final act today. But in general, it was definitely maze-like. There was definitely a labyrinthine quality to it. I was able to navigate it decently well. And there were a number of landmarks. There were a number of rooms that if I could get to them, I knew generally where other things were in relationship to those rooms. I did sometimes get lost, and sorry, I gotta. Okay. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think they walk a line very deliberately where they don't want you to be baffled by the architecture of the mansion. It is designed to be, you know, pretty intuitive, and some of that is in the different floors. Like, you know, there are 3 or 4 different floors, I guess, and so you always have a sense of like what floor you're on. You have a pretty good sense of like what cardinal direction things are organized in sort of blocks. It feels like, and some of that just has to do with what parts of the mansion get opened up at a time. I guess maybe we could call them wings because it's architecture, but it's so I definitely, like, I thought of a sort of whole block of rooms as the snake bar section of the house, and there were a block of rooms that were sort of the casino section, and there were a block of rooms that were the the bedrooms were all up on the second floor. Sort of that whole second floor area was all like, but I had a sense of some of those things, especially for those areas. And then as we started going west into the house, things got a little bit more vague. I couldn't remember like all of the paths through them really well, and had to look at the map a lot more. But I could still sort of find my way. It wasn't until the last part, those rooms down at the very, like, in the sub basement, that it got really confusing, and like the map wasn't always oriented properly, and I had to like really pay attention to that kind of thing. But yes, I think that was really deliberate, and I think some of it was to make the maze, the house feel maze-like, feel like really big and sprawling, and overwhelming, while still allowing you to navigate it, because navigating it was a lot of what you had to do. Negotiating parking with my fiance. Okay, Noise Crime asks, why haven't you played Thomas Was Alone? And when do you plan to resolve that awful gaming oversight? Thomas Was Alone has been up on the what game should I play on play-by-play Twitter poll a couple of times, and has never gotten voted for, which is not the only... I mean, that is at least part of the reason that I have not played Thomas Was Alone. It seems like a game that would be a good game to play on the show. Seems sort of simple and interesting, and short enough to like really to get through and do an analysis of. So, and it is also a game that I haven't felt like compelled, I guess, to play the way that there are some games that I'm just like so excited about, so into, I can't hold back. Thomas Was Alone looks really good, and from all reports is a very, very good game. But it's something that I've sort of figured at some point I would play on the show, and hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of games that I want to play for play-by-play. So at some point, I guess if there is tremendous enthusiasm about playing it on the show, then that could happen sooner than later. And alternatively, if people just like really do not care about Thomas Was Alone for whatever reason, then I could go off and play it by myself, take my toys and go home. Okay, Noise Crime also asks, did this game, Sexy Brutale, have to be linear? Would a more open world structure, after a decent amount of tutorial, work as well, better, or worse for the game? Perhaps they could have added it as an unlock for a more challenging New Game Plus mode. And after having described diorama games, what I'm going to say about this is I think that it is possible to craft an interesting experience that is this kind of mechanic in a more open world context. Or, I mean, even a like... Well, no, I guess in a more open world context. This game obviously was very linear. They locked off space very conscientiously so that you would move through it in a linear pattern. The space itself is not linear, and in most of these, not today, like tonight was actually super duper linear. But in previous segments, in previous parts of the game, there was a lot of trying to understand what's going on over the course of time throughout the space. And there were lots of different like ways to try to look at that. It was very nonlinear within the extremely confined space of that section, and then each of those sections was extremely linear. So I think you can make a diorama game, and a diorama game, like a really truly diorama game, would not be so linear. It would have maybe different kinds of constraints on how you move and consume information. I really liked the you can't be in a room with another person in this game. I thought that was really clever, and the way that they actually implemented that I thought was really clever, and created interesting constraints. And that's the kind of thing that you could do in a diorama game, but you wouldn't put like these locked doors that you need to solve puzzles in a straightforward fashion to unlock. Or you could do something like this, and I think this was very good. Like, I have no complaints about how this was structured. I don't think that you can effectively create a game, at least on this scale, that does both. That has like a new game plus that is... Well, I mean, I guess the new game plus would be you already have all of the keys to all of the sections. Like, it's just open, and that's fine. Like, by the end of the game, we were essentially at that. We had access to the whole manor. We could follow people around however we want. I'm sure that's how you get some of those additional like cards and things. But I don't think you can make it so that that is an interesting game in its own right, separate from the linear game that also takes place in the same space. I think you need to make a choice about which one you're going to do, and I think that this game made that choice, and it made a really good choice for the game it wanted to be. So I'm down with that, but it's not the only choice that you could make. You could definitely make an open world version of this mechanic. Okay, Kyla, more of a comment than a question, but I love how the game segments the various save people sections into confined areas, so you don't have too many possibilities. Yeah, because each of those is like a little diorama game and a little adventure game, and both diorama game and adventure game, I think, benefits from having a really tightly balanced possibility space. You don't want a diorama game to take place in a huge empty space where you spend all of your time just trying to find anything that's worth looking at. And you don't want an adventure game to take place in a possibility space of millions of inventory items that don't do anything. Like, we have seen how that goes terribly wrong. I agree with this 100%. I think this is part of like how it implemented that linearity and why that was an important part of the design. But I thought it was really well done. It was really well done. Would this game be improved by being more sexy and or less brutal? I'm going to say no. I'm hesitating because you certainly could make a version of this game. I mean, you could certainly make a diorama game, and you could make a diorama adventure game that is sexier than this. Like, that is an interactive media space and probably a market space. I mean, I guess you could do both. It would be really interesting. Oh shit, is oh damn it, Kyla, what's the name of the sorority murder the precursor to Five Nights at Freddy's? Night Terror, night something. I think it was Night something. I'm almost certain you know what I'm talking about. Night Trap. Thank you. Yes, Night Trap. I never played Night Trap. Night Trap actually maybe is a diorama game. Now that I think about it, I don't think Five Nights at Freddy's is. But it is it is dial up the sexy, dial up the brutal. You could do one that is dial up the sexy and bring the brutal way down. You could do all kinds of things with those two levers. I don't think that any of that necessarily makes a game better. than this one, Sexy Brutale. I really liked where this game landed. I do kind of think the title is a mistake. Like, I get it, and there's a funny joke in there where, like, that one funny joke robot like had to explain like why it was sexy, but I think that's in there because probably a lot of people blanched a little bit at the title, and like it's not a bad, it's just a weird name for this game because it implies something sexier, and it's just that's not what this game is. Which I like what this game is. It's just it seems like a weird marketing decision to me. Jetlag asks, will I see you tomorrow? Yeah. I believe so. I believe we can make that happen. I'm not gonna be down super early. I don't think anything starts until noon, it sounds like. But I will be down for the afternoon and some of the evening. At some point this weekend I gotta do lesson planning, so we'll see. But yeah, I'll be around all Friday afternoon, Friday evening, all day Saturday, something sort of like that. Is there a dragon in this game? Oh shit, I gotta engage with this, don't I? So I mean, yes, there was in fact that one picture of a dragon that was conveniently just sort of placed in this game, which was neat. I don't know where I would put a dragon. Okay, so actually putting a dragon in this game is fairly trivial. There is a bunch of weird shit because of the conceit that villain Lucas is like reconstructing this mansion to be as torturous as possible. And has put all kinds of weird shit in it, like a graveyard and a stairway of cards and a like gambling demon. You could easily have a room that contained a dragon. What would you do with the dragon? I'm not 100% sure. Most of these other things, I think, are at least thematically evocative, if not specifically representative of aspects of Lucas's guilt. Okay, so dragon, I think hoarding wealth, which does seem particularly resonant since the sort of impetus for this whole plot, which is narratively the weakest part of it, is that Lucas is out of money, has spent all of his money on this mansion, and now wants to destroy it in order to try to get that money back. A dragon that is either jealously guarding a treasure or sort of rampaging because its treasure is gone or has been taken away, or threatens to destroy the mansion if its treasure isn't returned to it. Having that as sort of an evocative set piece, akin to these other things, these other visions, I think would be really interesting and would fit in really nicely. I would put it probably somewhere in between the gambling demon, who appears quite early, who appears like sort of in Act 2 or something, if I remember correctly, in order to give you a motivation to keep collecting those cards. But then there's kind of a stretch between that and and then I guess there's the voodoo fish. Somewhere maybe after the voodoo fish is where I would put the dragon. I would just tuck it in a room that is like just tucked away. It's out of the way side room that you have to maybe figure out how to open or something like that. And you open it up and there's a fucking dragon in there, and he's really angry and he threatens to like burn down everything, and he wants you to bring him treasure. And then that could either be yet another collectible. It could be maybe like a shared collectible. Nah, I don't like that. Never mind. Or it could just be a fucking red herring. It could be like bring me my treasure, or I will burn down this whole house. I will burn down your world. And then there's no fucking treasure. There's nothing you can do to appease this dragon. And if that was the case, I would want it to. I would want to try to like pull you back to the dragon somehow. So maybe the dragon is in a more in a location that's a little bit more like central, or something like that. I mean, not like totally central, but you would pass through it maybe, or maybe you have to pass through it to get through like a secret passageway or something. I don't know, like that's a little tricky, but I do like this idea of like a dragon that is threatening to burn down the house, and that is the first suggestion that we get, that the house will burn down, but it's out of context and we don't necessarily take it seriously, and it sort of gives us the sense that there's a thing where we should be doing, but there is no treasure. There's nothing that we can bring it to satisfy it. I think that would be interesting. I mean, the other thing that I was thinking was, in our other interpretation of dragon, there are some really cool dragon moments, and like that fucking tree. What was the first one? I guess the first one was the clean room, the operating chamber, where we pushed some buttons and pulled back the mass, the sheet on one of the staff members, and it didn't reset. Like the first time that we discovered something that just didn't reset between loops, like that broke me a little bit. That was such a no, we've established what the rules of this world are. Like, why are you now breaking the rules of the world? So, okay, if you wanted to foreshadow that, going back to my earlier dragon, you got a dragon. It has lost its horde. It's raging. It doesn't leave its little room. Like it's stuck somewhere, but you see it several times, or it is somehow pervasive, and it's threatening to burn down the house, and it seems to be aware of the fact that you keep looping through time. Like, it remembers you in a way that it would be disconcerting because it shouldn't. That would be interesting too. I think that would be interesting. That's how I'd do a dragon. Foxstash asked just like the literal on the face question. Can you explain why it was called Sexy Brutale? It seemed brutal and not very sexy, and that is totally accurate. It's called Sexy Brutale after the name of the casino, and the casino is called Sexy Brutale because the allure of gambling is sexy and the consequences are brutal. And I have no problem with that as the name for a video game casino. I have no problem with it as the name of a game. It just, you're right. This is something that I have hit on several times, and I feel like I'm not the only one. It it doesn't seem like the correct name for this game. It just seems off. It doesn't set expectations properly. Valiant Venture is the repetition because you need to play as a single character for some extended period of time in order to immerse yourself and understand the narrative, or is it simply used to extend a rather short story to several times its length? I would say neither. These are interesting. Okay, so let me break this down. Extending a rather short story to several times its length. Okay. That's a cynical. I'm not saying that's a cynical interpretation of this. Yeah, I am. That's a cynical interpretation of this. That could be a cynical motivation for these kinds of mechanics. You'll find more discourse around this kind of a topic around database narrative, which has the same properties of you can take a relatively short story. If you were to gather all of the interesting the interesting sort of material in her story and just play it linearly, it's not long. Like it's pretty short. The game is much longer than that because the game is the process of discovering that. So I would push back against that cynical characterization of it. And then the other one is playing as a single character for extended period of time to immerse yourself and understand the narrative. That is really interesting, and there are stories that I feel like that is a really important component to the storytelling. And okay. Sorry, 1 second. I think about... This is not exactly the same thing. But I think about the narrative investment in a game like Dragon Age, in like one of the BioWare games, where part of, I think, how those games work is they make you care about side characters because of the amount of time that you have spent with them. I don't think that's really what's happening here. I think what's happening here, like with database narrative in sort of a traditional sense, is that the game is taking this story and is just taking a playful approach to presenting it. It's like you could write this as a short story, and I think it would be far less interesting. Not because the story isn't at its heart interesting, but because the playfulness of working within constraints to discover that story is satisfying. There's something that is just very pleasing about doing that, about trying to learn what's going on and to overcome obstacles, whether they're literal puzzles in the game or just the fact that you can't see everything at all times, and using that, like that is part of the enjoyable experience of coming to understand the story. So the repetition in my mind, the repetition is a tool that allows you to explore that narrative space, which happens over time, as thoroughly as you would like to do. You can follow one character around and figure out their whole deal for the whole, it's 12 hours, right? For the whole 12 hours, you can figure out their whole deal, and then you can go back and you can follow a different character around and figure out what their whole deal is. And you're probably not going to do that. You're probably just going to like try to find the bits and pieces, that are interesting, that are important to you. But you will end up doing some of this repetition because the way that it is designed, stuff goes on simultaneously. There's stuff happening in different places at the same time. And I think I find that not to be a gimmick, and not even to be a part of the narrative, not a narrative device to invest you in the story, but an interesting constraint on that makes this not a book, that makes this actually interactive media. Even though I'm not controlling the outcome of events, I do feel like I'm making choices. I do feel like I'm interacting because I feel like I am really exploring with agency, exploring a narrative space. Okay, there are still some questions. I'm gonna have to call it though. Thank you, everybody. That was great. These were fantastic questions. I really loved this game. This was a whole lot of fun. I just gotta go home and go to sleep, and get up tomorrow and drive to Long Beach. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. This was wonderful. I want to give a special shout out to everybody who has subscribed to this channel on Twitch, which is a thing that you can do if you would like to support me and the channel as a whole, and it's something that I really appreciate. If you like this community, if you like the people who hang out here in this chat, and you want more of it, then there are some places that you can go. There, you can go to the forum, you can go to the Steam group, you can go to the Discord, you can go to the YouTube channel and see all of our old episodes of previous games. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then please, would love to hear what you thought. Give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, depending on what you feel like doing, and leave a comment if you have a question or a comment about the video or the whole show, I guess, like whatever. Last time that I will remind you that it is still September, because it's the last time that it will be September until before I see you next, I guess. That sentence got away from me. I don't know what happened there. September, I think, ends this weekend. That is the period where Twitch is giving you half off if you subscribe to channels that you love. So whether that's this channel or other channels, I know that all of us who stream on Twitch appreciate subscribers greatly, and this is an excellent opportunity for you to do that. I will be at TwitchCon tomorrow on Saturday, like I said. There's not going to be a show next Thursday. There's not going to be a Mostly Walking on Monday either, because Day 9 is going to be still out of town. I have been running ragged and just need a little bit more of a break. So next week, Thursday, I'm going to take off. I'm going to have myself an early night, turn in, maybe do some Twitter based choose your own adventure game play with that extra time, but do something a little bit more relaxed, and then come back the week after that. I think eventually there's going to be a Thanksgiving. We will not have a show on Thanksgiving, but that's not for a while yet. So that's it. That's all my stuff. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for sticking around. Thank you for the great questions during Q&A. Have a fantastic weekend. If I don't see you in Long Beach, then I hope that you have a marvelous day tomorrow and a marvelous weekend, and a great week next week. And I will see you the week after that. All right. Have a good night.